In June of 1864, the war for America's future was entering its final and most desperate phase. Outside Petersburg, Virginia, General Ulysses S. Grant had finally pinned down Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. For the first time, the Confederacy's greatest army was trapped, forced into defensive trenches around a key rail hub that supplied Richmond itself. The South was in dire straits, but not yet finished. Across other theaters, Confederate commanders would make one last series of daring offensives, desperate attempts to turn back the tide. From the fields of Maryland to the plains of Missouri and the heart of Tennessee, the Confederacy would gamble everything on a final push toward victory. But each of these offensives would end in catastrophe, signaling the beginning of the war's endgame. The Siege of Petersburg, had the Union's Army of the James attacked boldly on June 9, Petersburg's thin defenses might have fallen easily. General P.G.T. Beauregard had constructed formidable fortifications, but he simply didn't have enough men to hold them. When Grant ordered another assault on June 15, the Union troops breached the Confederate lines, yet their commanders hesitated, throwing away their advantage. By the time Grant sent in the Army of the Potomac, Lee had arrived with reinforcements. Over 4 brutal days of fighting, every attack was repelled. On June 18, Grant accepted the grim reality: Petersburg would have to be taken by siege. The newspapers called him a butcher, but Grant's calculation was cold, not cruel. He knew that long encampments killed more soldiers through disease than any bullet could do. He preferred the risks of combat to the slow death of dysentery and starvation that plagued idle armies. Still, a siege meant exactly that, a slow, deadly stalemate. Lee's dilemma: for Robert E. Lee, the siege was worse than defeat. His army thrived on movement, on surprise, on bold attacks, not on sitting in trenches. Morale began to crumble, and Lee knew time was against him. There was no rescue army left. His only chance was to break the siege somehow, but Grant's numbers and entrenchments made that impossible. And then came worse news. Up the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia's breadbasket, a new Union commander, David Hunter, was cutting a path of destruction. Farms were burned, mills destroyed, and supplies that once fed Lee's army were gone. To save the valley, Lee sent 8,000 men under Jubal Early, a move that would open an entirely new front in the war. Early's invasion of Maryland. Early's campaign began as a defensive measure, but soon turned into something far more daring. Hunter's army had retreated into West Virginia, leaving the road to. In early July 1864, Early's 16,000 men crossed into Maryland, marching straight for Washington. The alarm spread fast. Rail lines were cut, telegraph wires downed, and Union forces scrambled to respond. But only one general, Lew Wallace, reacted quickly enough. The Battle of Monocacy. Wallace, commanding just 2,500 raw troops and militia, understood that he couldn't defeat Early, but he could delay him. He entrenched his men along the Monocacy River, guarding the bridges that led to both Baltimore and Washington. When Early's vanguard appeared on July 9, Wallace's small army fought fiercely, buying precious time. By nightfall, they were forced to retreat, but Early had lost an entire day. That day was everything. By the time his weary men reached the outskirts of Washington, reinforcements from Grant's army were already manning the cities. The Battle of Fort Stevens. On July 11, 1864, Confederate skirmishers appeared before Fort Stevens, just 5 miles from the White House. Inside the fort, the defenders were reinforced by battle-hardened Union troops. Early's men advanced under blistering artillery fire, but could make no headway. Among the defenders that day stood President Abraham Lincoln himself, the only sitting U.S. president ever to come under enemy fire. Lincoln calmly watched from the fort's ramparts as bullets snapped overhead. By the next day, Early realized he had missed his chance. He withdrew back into Virginia, his rate of failure. The campaign had achieved its goal of diverting Grant's attention for a moment, but Petersburg still held firm. Worse, the defeat encouraged Grant to send a new commander into the Shenandoah Valley, a man named Philip Sheridan. Sheridan's Shenandoah Campaign. Grant had grown tired of the Shenandoah stalemate. He gave Sheridan one order: destroy Early's army, and make the valley so barren that a crow flying over it will have to carry its own food. Sheridan's 40,000 veterans obeyed with ruthless efficiency. They burned barns, crops, and mills from Winchester to Staunton, leaving nothing for the Confederate cause. Early tried to fight back with the same fast maneuvers that once made Stonewall Jackson legendary, but it was 1864 now, not 1862. Sheridan's men were veterans, not green recruits. After a string of bloody defeats, Early launched one last gamble at Cedar Creek in October. At dawn, his troops surprised and routed Sheridan's army, but instead of pursuing, they stopped to plunder the Union camps. Sheridan, returning from a brief absence, famously rallied his men and counterattacked. By sunset, Early's army was shattered and fleeing. It was the end of Confederate power in the Shenandoah. Price's Missouri raid, far to the west, another doomed Confederate offensive was underway. In the Trans-Mississippi region, General Edmund Kirby Smith commanded what was effectively an isolated kingdom, cut off from Richmond by the Union Navy's control of the Mississippi River. His subordinate, General Sterling Price, insisted that if given men, he could liberate Missouri. Smith knew better, but he also saw an opportunity to, if Price's raid disrupted the upcoming elections or diverted Union troops, it might help the Southern cause. And if it failed, Smith would be rid of his most troublesome general. In September 1864, Price crossed into Missouri with about 12,000 men, many of them poorly armed and half-starved. Instead of striking quickly for St. Louis, he wasted time besieging a small fort at Pilot Knob. His men took heavy losses and captured little more than plunder. By the time he turned west toward Kansas City, Union forces were closing in from both directions. The Battle of Westport, on October 23, 1864, outside Kansas City, Sterling Price's army met its end at the Battle of Westport, sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West. Union generals Samuel Curtis and Alfred Pleasonton trapped the Confederates between their converging armies. Price's troops fought fiercely but were hopelessly outnumbered. Surrounded and out of ammunition, they set the prairie on fire to cover their retreat. By the time Price's men staggered back into Arkansas, half were dead, captured, or had deserted. The Great Missouri Raid had accomplished nothing, except to prove that Missouri would never again rise for the Confederacy. Hood's Tennessee gamble. While the Western offensives collapsed, the final and most disastrous Confederate campaign was about to begin east of the Mississippi. After losing Atlanta, President Jefferson Davis replaced General Joseph Johnston with the aggressive but reckless John Bell Hood. Davis believed Hood could march north, retake Tennessee, and perhaps even threaten Kentucky, forcing Sherman to abandon his march to the sea. It was a fantasy, but Hood believed it. In November 1864, with 40,000 men, he crossed into Tennessee to destroy Union forces under General George Thomas. The road to Franklin, Hood's opponent, General John Schofield, skillfully avoided being trapped. At the crossroads town of Spring Hill, miscommunication and poor coordination allowed Schofield's army to slip right past Hood's sleeping officers. By dawn, they were entrenched at Franklin, just south of Nashville. When Hood discovered this, he was furious. Ignoring his general's protests, he ordered a frontal assault against fortified Union lines, a suicidal move. At sunset on November 30, 1864, 20,000 Confederates charged across open ground into devastating fire. The assault briefly broke through, but Union counterattacks sealed the breach. 6 Confederate generals, including the brilliant Patrick Cleburne, were killed, and the Army of Tennessee was destroyed in all but name. The Battle of Nashville. Still, Hood refused to stop. He pursued Schofield to Nashville, where George Thomas awaited him behind strong fortifications with more than 50,000 men. Outnumbered 2-1, Hood dug in and waited, hoping to draw Thomas out. For 2 freezing weeks, the two armies stared at each other. Finally, on December 15, Thomas attacked. Union troops stormed Hood's positions, driving them back with overwhelming force. The next day, Thomas crushed what was left of the Confederate line. By the time Hood's army staggered south into Alabama, fewer than 15,000 men remained. The proud Army of Tennessee, once the heart of the Confederate West, had ceased to exist. The end approaches. By early 1865, the Confederacy was running on fumes. Its last field armies were shattered. Its cities were under siege. And Abraham Lincoln had just been re-elected, ensuring that there would be no negotiated peace. The final offensives of 1864 had cost the South everything: its last reserves of men, its food supplies, and its hope. Now, only Robert E. Lee remained, still entrenched at Petersburg, still holding the line, but knowing the end was inevitable. The question was no longer if the Confederacy would fall, but when. In our next episode, we'll witness the dramatic conclusion of the Civil War, the fall of Petersburg, the flight of Jefferson Davis, and the surrender at Appomattox. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of the American Rewind. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.